Hi everybody, William Eckert, Potsdam Public Library Adult Program Coordinator with you again, here at the Remington Art Museum in Ogdensburg, New York, with the museum's curator and educator, Laura Desmond. Hi Laura, thank you for having us.
Hi William, nice to have you here.
We're going to be doing a virtual tour with Laura today, and she's going to be giving those of you that have never had the opportunity to be here to get a view of kind of some of the things that they have on exhibit, to get a taste, to lure you in. You come down and see kind of the wonderful paintings and sculptures, the bronzes, and be able to spend some time with some of the wonderful folks here that can talk to you about the artwork that they have on display. This is the beginning of a partnership between the Potsdam Public Library and the Frederic Remington Art Museum, where we'll be having a rotating exhibit and activities with employees from the library and the museum as well, working together to further educate the community about the works of Frederic Remington and some of the collections related to Remington that we have in our library. But this isn't the beginning of the connection between Potsdam and the Remington Museum. Laura, there was another connection between Potsdam and the Remington.
There have been many over the years, but the one that we talked about. So this museum opened in 1923. Eva Remington is responsible for the existence of this museum. She bequested to the Ogdensburg Public Library her entire collection of Frederic Remington's artworks and correspondence and ephemera, and the museum opened several years after her death in this building as the Remington Art Memorial in 1923, and its very first curator was Sarah Raymond of Potsdam Raymond fame, and so she was responsible for getting this young museum up and running and opening it to the public in order to preserve Eva Remington's desire that Remington's artistic legacy should be preserved and promoted.
That's awesome.
It is awesome.
Now, the Remington Museum is more than just the building in which we're going to be doing the virtual tour.
That is correct. So the museum started in this beautiful 1810 parish mansion, but over the years there have been expansions to include the beautiful galleries that house Remington's work, and additions of the two adjacent properties. So the building next door houses our office space and also some public event space, and 2 doors down is the Eva Caton Remington Education Center, which is the home to our Children's Museum, Kids Place. The Children's Museum is currently closed due to the pandemic, but I certainly hope that when we reopen, people with children will bring them along for really great, engaging, interactive exhibits and art making surrounding and making use of Remington's work to inspire creativity.
And we'd love to come back as well and maybe do a virtual tour of that museum when it's reopened.
That will be great.
Get the folks to see what you have to offer there.
Yeah.
Now, for folks that are coming to visit for the first time, what do they need to know about hours, admission, things like that?
Yeah, so first of all, I should say we are here in Ogdensburg, New York, and the beautiful St. Lawrence River is in sight, just behind the camera, and so when visitors are coming, they should check for our hours. We have different hours in the summer months as opposed to the winter months. We're currently from October through May, that's our winter hours. We're closed on Mondays and Tuesdays, but Wednesday through Saturday we're open 11 to 5 and Sunday from 1 to 5 during these winter months. And then come summertime we'll be open 7 days a week. And the museum is always free to Ogdensburg residents, to members of the museum, to children 15 and younger, but others there's an admission scale. There are various discounts for seniors or people in active duty military and so on. So they should check either on our webpage, to see which rates will apply to them before their visit.
We should also mention that today is a Monday and that the museum is closed, so we'll be doing this virtual tour, you know, to have the convenience of being able to get this tour to ourselves, to not to have limited interaction with the public during the time of the pandemic, and to, of course, minimize stealing Laura away from all of the work that you would have during the open hours. So why don't you take us inside? We'll take you inside, and we'll see what there is to see, and Laura will give us a fantastic education on Frederic Remington.
Thank you. Welcome. So here we are in the lobby of the Frederic Remington Art Museum, and as you look around, you can see first that it's decorated for the holidays, but this beautiful oak paneling that is part of a 1890s Victorian renovation of the beautiful 1810 federal building that was built by David Parrish. And so when you enter into this lobby, you'll be greeted as a visitor by the staff in the lobby who will orient you to the museum, just as I'll do now, before we take our little tour today. They might ask about your interests and give you some background on Frederic Remington and let you know what's available for you to see during your visit at the museum. So you will be told that we recommend that you start with our wonderful collection of original artwork by Frederic Remington. The museum stewards the world's largest public collection of artwork by Remington. It is a comprehensive collection of his sketches and drawings and paintings and sculptures. Over 6,000 objects are in the collection here at the museum, and many of them are on display for your deep conversation when you visit the museum. So when we take our tour today, we will begin by looking at the artwork of Remington, but you'll see also in the lobby this wonderful bronze soldier, which is not by Frederic Remington, but in fact by another Ogdensburg-based artist, Sally James Farnham, and the museum has just completed a brand new permanent exhibition dedicated to Sally James Farnham, which is upstairs in the museum and which we will also get a chance to view today. So I guess I can just give you a quick little background on Remington just to contextualize what we're going to see on our tour. Probably, if you're familiar at all with Remington, you think of him as a Western artist. He is most famous for his representations of the Western frontier, probably along with the filmmaker John Ford. He is most responsible for creating our ideas of the West and the sort of building the mythos of the West that most of us as Americans have. But Remington was not only a Western artist, and he was in fact from here, from the North Country, born in Canton, moved to Ogdensburg when he was 11, and throughout his entire life he maintained close ties to the North Country, returned here through his life, owned an island in the Thousand Islands for the last 10 years of his life, where he did many of his paintings, both of Western subjects, but also of the Eastern subjects, including North Country artworks, some of which we'll see. And so that's something that many visitors to the museum are surprised to see when they come here for the first time. They come expecting to see cowboys and soldiers and Native Americans and stampedes and they find those things, but they find also these many wonderful Eastern subjects as well. So that is something that we can get a chance to explore a little bit when we go into the galleries. So Remington probably got into his subject matter
out of a fascination with things military as a young man, boy and a young man. His father was a Civil War officer and hero, and I think like many young people of his generation, of that post-Civil War generation, he grew up with, you know, the events of the Civil War looming large, and he was fascinated with all things military. And so if you were a young budding artist who was interested in representing soldiers, the West would have been the place where you went, because 2/3 of the US military was stationed in the West after the Civil War. So I think that it was really his interest in soldiers and military subjects that drew him to the West above all. So we will take a look at some Western art, we'll take a look at some Eastern art, and start getting a sense of what you can see when you visit here, and the kinds of conversations that you might be able to have around the art that's on display at the museum. So let's take a little walk. And as you pass through this door and move toward this hallway, you are greeted by Remington's large-size Bronco Buster. This was a remodeling of what's probably his most famous artwork. The Bronco Buster was the very first the very first sculpture that Remington ever created. So Remington got his start as an illustrator. He was creating flatworks for all of the great publications of his day. But in the mid-1890s, at the suggestion of a friend who saw how adept Remington was at drawing his subjects from any possible angle or perspective, said, "You've got a sculptor's range of vision. You should try your hand at sculpting." And he did, and a year later he had modeled the Bronco Buster, which was a really innovative work of art. When you look at this sculpture, what do you see? What do you notice? Probably stands out to you just how much action is going on in this sculpture, right? Maybe you see that it is a moment of conflict, and Remington very much takes up conflict and violence as a subject in very many of his artworks. But he's also especially good at giving us a sense that we're seeing a snapshot in a larger set of events that are unfolding, so that we begin to imagine what came before this moment that we're seeing, what's going to happen next after what we're seeing before us. And so here he dramatizes the conflict between this bronco, a wild horse that's never been tamed to saddle, and the cowboy whose job it is to get this horse to accept a saddle and rider on its back. And so it's a lot of fun to have a conversation about who you think might be winning this particular contest between horse and rider. And one of the things that's really a lot of fun also about Remington's work is he puts in lots and lots of details that give you evidence that you could bring to bear in a conversation about an event with uncertain outcomes. We don't know for sure who is going to win this particular battle, but Remington gives us a cowboy who looks really well poised and skilled and intent upon his task. But then you notice details like the fact that the cowboy's boot has come out of the stirrup, so he's got perhaps less stability than he might want to have in bringing this horse under control. So it's a lot of fun to take the time looking closely at the details that Remington gives us as we draw out the story that Remington is creating in his artworks. And of course, at the literal level, this is about a struggle between horse and rider, but thinking back to that mythos of the West that I mentioned, right, more metaphorically, this is a sculpture that's about the taming of the West, about taking what is wild and uncivilized and taming it, bringing it under control. And so this becomes a much more iconic image when we put it in that larger framework of the attempts to conquer the wilderness. And of course, many people, I think, have seen this particular sculpture in the background of the Oval Office at the White House. You may have seen it there as part of the setting in any number of presidents across the political spectrum. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican, the presidents seem to select this artwork as an important piece from the White House collection to keep on display in the Oval Office. So as you walk through this part of the museum on the way to the galleries where you'll see Remington's artwork, we provide a lot of historical information, so a timeline of Remington's life and how it fits into what was going on in the country at the time. And we offer quite a number of artifacts and objects that will give you ample scope to explore more fully Remington's historical context. There are objects that will, I think, give a lot of satisfaction to history buffs. We've got lovely historic firearms. We've got items that belong to Remington himself, pages from his juvenile sketchbooks, images from time spent in nearby Cranberry Lake. There's a nice Cranberry Lake connection with Remington. He did quite a bit of camping and quite a bit of artwork at camp in Cranberry Lake. But you'll find also plenty of primary documents. So if that's your thing, poring over primary documents from the late 1800s, early 1900s, this is a great place for you to stop and stare at photos and sketches and prints. Some of these objects are things that were in Remington's studio, and if you are able to see, I'm not sure if you can through the glass, this painting by Lyle Carr of the inside of Remington's studio in New Rochelle, you'll see that it is chock full of items like saddles and blankets and rugs and pots and pans and firearms, uniforms. And Remington, as an artist, was very careful to include historically specific and correct details in his artwork, which give you the feeling that he was right there on the scene and documenting what he saw right before him. But in fact, Remington's artworks are creations of imagination. He made these artworks in his studio back east. He worked just outside of New York City. He was very much part of the New York art scene, and he was creating in his imagination these scenes of the West, but with a studio chock full of authentic Western objects. He was able to populate his paintings and drawings and sculptures with correct details to give that feeling of authenticity in his artwork. So it's common for people to think of Remington as being a sort of documentarian of the West, but he's very much a creative artist who is creatively incorporating historical artifacts into his work. Let you walk in ahead of me and take a look around as I hold the door. So as you enter the gallery, of course, you're probably magnetically drawn to this beautiful atrium in the center of the room where we've displayed Remington's bronzes. We have a very fine collection of bronze sculptures by Remington. You're looking there at the Stampede, which he had just finished modeling at the time of his death in 1909. So Remington was only 48 years old when he died. So he managed to create a remarkable volume of artwork in the course of a very short career. He created over 3,400 flatworks and 22 different subjects in bronze in the course of his career. And so this is a great place to explore both of those things, the sculptures and the paintings and drawings. For example, since we already talked about the Bronco Buster, though perhaps you want to look at the Bronco Buster here in its original smaller size, which is what he modeled in 1895. During the visit, your visit here, you'll always find that there is a staff person on hand in the gallery who is more than happy to answer any questions about the artworks that you might have while you're here. I think that artworks are best revealed in conversation with other people. So if you come by yourself, I recommend that you talk with the staff person here, or come with your friends or family and start exploring what it is you see. We have quite a number of excellent pairings that help you explore in real depth what Remington was about as a sculptor, to better understand his creative process. So these are two different castings of his beautiful sculpture, the Cheyenne. And it's like his Bronco Buster, a very innovative sculpture. Prior to Remington, if you saw an equestrian sculpture, a sculpture of a horse and rider, it was likely that the horse would have all four feet on the ground, maybe one would be raised up. Then Remington comes along, and like you saw with the Bronco Buster, right? Suddenly you've got this rearing horse, this dramatic action going on. So too with the Cheyenne. So Remington's also notable as one of the first artists who depicted the gait of a horse in motion and in gallop correctly. So it was typical prior to this period and to the groundbreaking work of the photographer Edward Muybridge, who captured the gaits of different animals in motion with photography. It was typical to see horses in gallop presented rather like a rocking horse, with 2 legs out in front and 2 legs behind, and Remington depicted them with all 4 hooves and legs tucked up underneath the horse. But there's the challenge for a sculptor. If you want to create a equestrian sculpture of a horse in full gallop with 4 hooves off the ground, how does it work logistically, right? What's holding up the sculpture if all 4 hooves are in the air, right? So you can look at this and tell me what you think, right? He's done this really innovative thing where he's taken the buffalo robe that the Cheyenne is sitting on and draped it trailing along the ground, which forms the support for this galloping horse. Another really wonderful opportunity that's created by having these 2 different casts of the Cheyenne, number 2 and number 12, is that you can see and learn something about Remington's process and his partnership with the foundry with which he worked, the Roman Bronze Works. As soon as a casting technique known as lost wax bronze casting became available in the US, he latched on to the possibilities that are afforded by this process, which are that you can make variations in your subject between each individual cast of the subject, so that with these lifetime casts of the Cheyenne that were made while Remington was alive, he could make changes to his initial model for the Cheyenne, making each one special and unique with whatever the particular vision for that individual casting might be. So when you look at these 2 casts of the Cheyenne, I'm sure that you can spend a good deal of time picking out variations, like the differences in the shape of the tail here, right? This one has a swooping, curving tail, while this one's fluttering out behind. Remington moved the shield from its placement high up here on the back down below and added these trailing feathers flying along behind. There are changes in the mane, changes in the hoof position. All of these things are things that you can spend some time drawing out as you look, and the same is true of the 2 casts of the Remington that are across the atrium for me here in the museum. So lots of opportunity for fun while you're looking at Remington sculptures. I'll talk about one more before we move on to look at a few of the paintings. This is, as I mentioned, the Stampede, which is Remington's the last work that he modeled. And in fact, Sally James Farnham, whom I mentioned before, and the exhibit of whose work we'll see upstairs, was asked by Frederic Remington's widow, Eva, to oversee the production of this work in bronze with Roman Bronze Works, the foundry. But this is really another terrific work that's, again, full of all of the drama and action that I was mentioning before. Remington's taken this moment of real chaos and terror of a stampede when these longhorn cattle have, at some stimulus, taken to stampeding across the plains. And so he's got his rider upright in the saddle, looking very focused on the task at hand, which is to turn this mass of stampeding cattle around on itself so that it will stop stampeding. But it's a very dramatic scene. You can see that it looks almost as if this cattle is about to fall. He's made this really movementful base that conjures up the dust that's raised off the ground. And I think, like many Remington works, like there's a sort of soundscape that maybe goes along with it. You can imagine the sounds, the smells that might be in the scene were you present on the scene. So I think we'll walk over this way. I think I'll start with the work that maybe, if you're familiar with any of Remington's paintings, is the one you're most likely to be familiar with. I think this is among his most famous paintings, The Charge of the Rough Riders. So Remington was a war correspondent during the War of 1898, also known as the Spanish-American War. He was with the troops in Tampa, Florida, before they went over to Cuba, and then was also there behind the lines with the troops in Cuba. And this painting was created, commissioned by this guy, Teddy Roosevelt, as an illustration for an article that Roosevelt wrote about a decisive battle in the War of 1898, the Battle of the San Juan Heights. And so Remington represents here the moment when the U.S. artillery suddenly started providing cover for the troops and enabled them to rush up the hill toward the Spanish fortifications that were on the top of the hill. And of course, he has created this action-filled canvas. So one of the devices that Remington uses a lot in his work, in terms of the composition, where he places things on the camera, is the inverted triangle, right? So things that have this shape are action-filled, right? Because an inverted triangle's tippy, right? Things can go either way. And so he's got this inverted triangle here. And of course, we've got this one line going up here to Teddy Roosevelt, right? Giving him pride of place. A lot of our eye likes to move up that way. But then, of course, we've got this other group going down here. Something that I find really fascinating about this work is that Remington chose to put pride of place to this African-American soldier in the center of the group, right? Everybody else is wearing hats, and we see instead that this soldier, one of the African-American soldiers known as Buffalo Soldiers, is there without his hat, and he's got this bright red neckerchief around his neck. So Remington really wanted our attention to be drawn to this soldier. And you know, one of the sets of conversations that it's possible to have here at the museum is conversations about race in America and Remington and race. Remington often gets described as a racist, but I'd say that it's a complicated story when we start looking at his representations. He was one of the first artists to bring to the public's attention the heroism and professionalism and service of the African American troops out west, that were out west after the Civil War. He wrote and illustrated articles about some of the heroism of these troops, and yet at the same time, he does sometimes in his writing make racist remarks or say things that are condescending, I would say, with respect to African Americans. But it's kind of a mixed bag, and it's interesting to explore those topics as you look at Remington's representations in his artwork. So There's plenty more, of course, to explore here, but we have limited time, so you'll have to come back and we can spend more time with the Charge of the Rough Riders. I was going to mention this one because it's often quite an aha moment for visitors when they are told that this particular painting goes with a moose head that is hanging on the far side of the gallery. So Remington and his pal, his friend Julian Ralph, who's a writer, concocted the scheme to get Harper's Monthly to pay for a moose hunting expedition in Quebec, and Julian would write the story and Fred would provide the illustrations, and Harper's bought, so the two of them went up to Montreal, outfitted themselves in their capots and other gear to go off into the woods with their Quebecois guides to the moose yards to do some moose hunting. And so in this particular painting, we have a self-portrait. This is Fred standing outside the door of the cabin, lighting his pipe. And on the other side of the gallery, you can see the moose that was shot on this expedition. So you've already seen a little bit of Remington, the hyper-realistic artist who puts in all of these realistic details, but particularly in the last 10 years of his life, really after his time in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, his work took a turn to I guess what we could call a more modernist turn. He began to experiment with and then use pretty fully impressionistic techniques, and his subject matter, while it never really completely lost the focus on subjects and narrative, it became more dark, and it also became literally more dark. He started to produce these nocturnes, night paintings. He got really taken up with the challenge of trying to represent the colors of night, what we see at night. And he would go out, for example, in his canoe from his home in Chippewa Bay on the island, Inglenook, and try to capture the colors and light that he would observe at night. And so the subjects also become more psychologically dark. I mean, I guess you could say that the kind of conflict and violence and death that we see in even his earlier work is dark, but he tends to put it in a rather heroic light in the earlier part of his career. But he seems ready to explore the darker aspects of that after his, I think, experiences of suffering and death in Cuba during the war. And so this is a particular favorite of mine, The Last March. It's such a masterful use of color. That's part of what I love about it. I'm just really taken with the palette of this work, the way that the sand of the desert is this sort of luminous pale green, but then this incredibly poignant subject matter of this riderless horse surrounded by wolves that just keeps plodding forward when it seems to us that the end is probably near. It is, as I said earlier, you still got that narrative thing, so you're like, what happened to the rider, right? And Remington's very good at really fully deploying the sympathy between horse and rider and letting providing lots of the emotional content of the work through the posture and details of the horses as well as the humans in his work. But here we've got no human, but we're still we have I think in our imagination a sense of the loss of the rider, and it just becomes this incredible exploration or reflection on, the inevitability of death, on loneliness, aloneness. It's a really incredible work, and not in the sort of heroic vein that we saw in Charge of the Rough Riders, though even that has a little bit of complication, I would say, in terms of how we feel about the scene before us. But we've got a very nice collection of Remington's nocturnes here, and they're among my favorite works. I also love about this one these really wacky stars that he put in the sky. They're outsized, they're it's very impressionistic. They're not an attempt to be realistic stars. They're these daubs of yellow with a little daub of red on top of them. And I really appreciate that he was willing to and ready to let go of that realist impulse in order to help create a sensibility and a mood in his painting. This is a favorite, I think, for many visitors to the museum, and it's definitely one of the northern scenes that I mentioned before. This is the end of the day, so we've got a logging camp, and anybody who lived in the North Country in this period would have been very familiar with logging. The spring drives would have come down the Grass River, down the St. Regis, right? All of our local rivers were in use as part of the logging industry, but the logging camps were working in winter. That was the best and easiest time for moving trees around and getting them all stockpiled along the waterways and ready for the spring drive. And so Remington here, so again, another nocturne, but just that sort of twilight hour of when the logger and his team have come in from a very long day of hauling trees around, and we've got the sledge being unhitched, and that sort of sympathy between human and horse that I mentioned before is really present here. Like both the logger and the two horses, they have this coat of ice on their backs. They both are a little bit hunched against the snow, but also maybe hunched over with exhaustion at the end of the day. And he's got this beautiful light suffusing, the illusion of beautiful light suffusing this painting. And then, amazingly, he, drew his brush over what was more or less a completed painting in order to get that effect of the light drawn across the canvas. But then, of course, he gives us this one little warm patch of, the cookhouse, no doubt, waiting up there to warm the logger at the end of the day. And presumably the horses have a nice big manger full of hay waiting for them in their stables as well. So I don't know if you were able to sort of take a big view around. I don't want to spend too much time. We could talk about every artwork in here and be here all day long, but I just wanted you to get a bit of a foretaste of what is on view. Right, so you're looking at the scalp right there. I mentioned the sort of typical equestrian subject, and this is very much what you would expect to see in a sort of heroic equestrian sculpture. You know, three legs on the ground, one raised, this very dominant sort of position. But instead of the conquering general or soldier, Remington has given us a Native American figure, heroically positioned with a scalp in hand. And just like Remington's representations of African Americans, we can have the same depth, if not more, depth of conversation about his representations of Native Americans. If you were here right now, I'd say stop me and ask me any questions that you might have about these artworks that you're looking at. I mentioned Remington's Impressionism. And you're looking right now at a very good example of that. In the last summer of his life, Remington had a share in a hunting camp complex that is in western Quebec, and painted some beautiful plein air paintings of the landscapes there. So plein air outdoor painting. He did these beautiful impressionistic works depicting the landscape around the Pontiac Club in Canada. So you were just in the Albert P. Newell Gallery, and now we enter the Addie P. Newell Gallery. And the exhibits in this room are more likely to change over time. So many, whereas those that were in the gallery you just saw are more stable. You can count on most of those works being there unless they go out on loan for an exhibition. But in these galleries, you might find things changing from one visit to another. More impressionistic works. These are paintings of Inglenook, Remington's island in the Thousand Islands. So that's the boathouse that was there at the time, no longer exists, but a really spectacular impressionistic painting that does as much justice to the details of our eastern scenes as we see in his western scenes. We've got a very large collection of drawings and sketches by Remington, which is a truly wonderful resource for anybody who's interested in his creative process, like how he moved from idea to finished work. We can match up sketches with completed paintings, see what changed in the course of execution. We have lots of sketches that are just one small detail that would make its way into a finished work. And the museum's in the process of digitizing that vast collection of sketches so that they will eventually be completely accessible to the public. sculpture, Coming Through the Rye, is another that is in the White House's collection, but it's not the one that's selected for display in the Oval Office. So the title might clue you in to what's going on with the subject matter, Coming Through the Rye. Remington's depicting these cowboys who've just finished up a drive. They've got their huge paychecks and they've gone on a bender in town, and he's done such a terrific job creating jovial, these are happy drunks, right? They've got such jovial expressions on their faces as they, we imagine, ride through town, shooting their guns off into the air, having a great time. And again, Remington is playing around with creating this sense of action and movement, because we've got 4 horses, with 16 hooves between them, but only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hooves are on the ground, right? The rest of these horses are flying through the air. Remington is said to have remarked that he would like his epitaph to be, "He knew the horse." Didn't work out that way, but another very popular set here are these terrific horse studies, which show Remington's appreciation for the variety of, body types and postures and temperaments of the horses that existed around him. Another one of the exhibits in the Addie Newell Gallery is our annual Artist in Residence curates an exhibit of Remington works that are not currently on display around some theme or subject, whatever is of interest to the particular artist in residence. And so our artist in residence, Rich Federchak, created this beautiful exhibit called Portraits and Pastorals that was interested in the portraits and landscape work that Remington did, looking at the more intimate maybe side of Remington's work, and also he very much was into the less violent and conflict oriented Remington work. So he did a fine selection of these portraits and landscape work. So, and this work is another one of my favorites from the collection, and definitely an excellent point of focus for that conversation about race and Remington and race that I mentioned earlier. So it's called 9th Cavalry Colored Troops on Washing Duty in the Gulf, and so this is in Tampa, Florida, when the troops were waiting to be shipped over to Cuba, and Remington has represented the African American troops, the Buffalo Soldiers, as they're washing themselves and their gear in the Gulf of Mexico. And it is, to my knowledge, Remington's only known completed nude. And so in terms of thinking about Remington and race and representations of African Americans by white artists, on the one hand, he somehow feels authorized to represent the black male body in a way that he didn't the white body, right? If he didn't complete finished works with that were nude white men. And so, you have to ask, like, what does this say about his feelings? It makes you think about, the black body as property, as what can, as something that can be used and mobilized by white people at will. and at the same time, he's created these absolutely like classically perfect bodies for the buffalo soldiers that he's presented here. So he's really idealized those bodies at the same time. It's just such a masterful work in terms of how he lays down the ink on the paper. Remington was very good at what we call ink washes, of which this is an example. And so it's a great piece of art to have a conversation with. So we spent a lot of time in the galleries. Of course, we could spend hours more, but we should probably move on to some of the other areas of the museum. I guess there's one other artwork I would love to share briefly with you. I mentioned outside that this museum really exists through the foresight of Eva Remington, Fred's widow, and this is a portrait of Eva painted by Fred, and I think it's such a magnificent portrait, catching her, she looks in her own world. He's done this really minimal hint of landscape, a tiny bit of land for her to stand on and the hint of an island or shore behind her. And she, is looking off, not trying to present herself as beautiful or posing for the artist. Now we're upstairs in the museum and in the Winter Gallery, where you will find right now the 2020 New York State Juried Art Exhibit, juried by the talented and thoughtful Ottawa-based artist Mary Ann Varley. And she selected a wonderful grouping of artwork created by artists working in New York State. And the exhibits in this space change throughout the year. We've got 5 different exhibits, always at present at least, by contemporary artists. This New York State exhibit alternates every other year with our international juried art exhibit. The other juried art exhibits, and I want to say to those who are watching this who are working artists, you are more than welcome to submit your artwork to any of these shows. We have a annual college student juried art exhibit, and we have a members juried art exhibit that opens each May. So we very much value the work that our regional artists are doing. They are such an important part of the museum's community, and also for me as particularly in my work as an educator, such a great way to help visitors explore the art making process, to be thinking about the choices that artists are making when they create their work. It is very nice to have such a range of styles and techniques and mediums available on the walls here. And I think some of you may have come to this gallery in the past because we also host an annual middle school and high school exhibit and an annual elementary art exhibit. So we invite the art teachers from all of our regional schools to submit artworks that are created by their students. So in that case, the art teachers are playing juror in each of their schools, and we get to share the wonderful work that's being done in arts education throughout the North Country. So those exhibits take place in this gallery, and if you look toward the other end of the hallway, maybe we can walk down there and see the remainder of the exhibit is on display here. panning by the elevator there, I should mention that the museum is fully accessible, so please don't hesitate about coming if you have concerns about the accessibility of the exhibits in the museum. I'm very excited to share with you the most recent addition to the museum's exhibits. This is a brand new permanent exhibit dedicated to the artist Sally James Farnham, who was a younger contemporary of Remington's. The two of them were friends and colleagues. Farnham sought out Remington's advice when she was newly taking up the work of sculpting. And as I mentioned when we were in the galleries, Farnham was asked by Eva Remington to oversee the production of Remington's final two sculptures, actually, the Stampede and also his remodeled large-size Bronco Buster, which is where we started out. So in some sense, this exhibit is one aspect of Remington's legacy that we're exploring, his mentorship and encouragement of the next generation of artists, because really Farnham was just starting out during Remington's last decade of life. She was an extremely gifted portraitist. She did quite a number of equestrian subjects that certainly shows her relationship to Remington's work, but she was probably most famous in her day as a monumental sculptor. She created, if you have visited the Avenue of the Americas in New York City, Boulevard Plaza, that's where the Avenue of Americas meets Central Park. Her monumental sculpture of Simon Bolivar is there in Boulevard Plaza. And she also created, you saw the soldier in the lobby of the museum. That soldier used to stand at the base of a Civil War monument that stands across the street from the museum in Library Park. Farnham won the commission in 1904. The sculpture was dedicated in 1905, Civil War monument, with a spectacular winged victory atop a pillar, and the soldier stood guard at the base. And so we have a local example of her monumental sculpture as well. Yeah, you're looking now at her really stunning Joan of Arc. So where you might, in some presentations of the figure of Joan, see her very martial on horseback in a sort of heroic mode. Here she is dismounted, and she looks so small beside her gorgeous destrier, but is sort of glancing heavenward, sort of showing some of Joan's spiritual force, right? Saint Joan in this particular interpretation of the figure. One of the mounted policemen of Central Park Farnham was a dedicated rider. She rode almost every day in Central Park. It was something also that she shared with Remington, this love of horses and riding. So she made that terrific portrait of a mounted policeman. And that's courtship of two elephants, or spring in the jungle. Farnham created quite a number of medals in the course of her career as well. Some were commissioned, like the John Drew Medal that you're seeing now, in honor of 50 years of stage work by the American actor John Drew, but also these National Navy Club medals, which she donated her efforts for a fundraiser for activities for sailors when they'd come into port in New York City. We've got another Teddy Roosevelt connection here. You saw Roosevelt down in the Charge of the Rough Riders, but Farnham also modeled this bas-relief portrait of Roosevelt, commissioned for Jacob Riis Settlement House in New York. Well, thank you so much for coming along on this virtual tour. I definitely invite you to come in person at any time. During the winter, we are closed on Mondays and Tuesdays, but the other days of the week, we are ready to have you come visit. We are currently open. During the pandemic, we've got the normal sort of rules and regulations in place about mask wearing, and we've got many hand sanitizing stations in place to keep you safe during your visit. It's a great place to come for a non-crowded and in-depth experience if you're looking for something to do during these times of reduced activities. I want to say, usually when people finish the range of activities, they take a gander through our gift shop, which you are also welcome to shop anytime. I should also say that some of our materials are also available online. So if you visit the museum's webpage, fredericremington.org, you can see some of the artworks. The New York State Juried Art Exhibit and past Juried Art exhibits are available in a virtual form as well. So if you're not able to make it to the museum in person at this time, you can still explore a lot of these artworks from afar. So I do hope that you'll come and see us anytime, and we will be happy to talk with you about anything that is on display at the exhibit. Thanks so much. Bye.